Crimson Skies appeals to a certain aesthetic, both in how the world is written and how the stories are written. It seems to appeal to the aesthetic of aircraft, flying, and air combat from the interwar and Second World War eras. It also appeals to the type of vintage pulp adventure where the characters and their depth are a secondary concern to the depth of the story and especially the mysteries portrayed. In this world and the adventures therein, pilots are not just pilots, nor just fighter pilots, but as facilitated and required by the stories, they're also portrayed as private investigators, con artists, and specifically gang and pirate leaders. If the stories we just experienced happen from the point of view of militia pilots, we might get a closer approximation of fighter pilot life as experienced by real-life fighter pilots of our real-life wars. It just so happens we have yet to cover such stories. In this world, air combat doesn't revolve around military campaigns, neither of defense nor conquest, because the world of these disunited states of America doesn't revolve around conquering territory so much as maintaining law and order when the fragmented geopolitics makes it far easier for criminal activity to cross borders and escape law enforcement, i.e., cops and robbers with airplanes. The stories themselves actually get framed as a fictional publication from an old-fashioned book publisher called Spicy Air Tales. So what happens in the stories can be interpreted as appealing to the sense and taste of the readers, or even the publishers and producers themselves. In other words, there may be a disconnect between what is really happening in the world and what the publisher puts out for the sake of enticing readers and selling pulp books. From this perspective, characterization and technical details would indeed take a back seat to moving a story and the mystery along, safely assuming that anything technical would be known to the reader or easily sourced from elsewhere. At the same time, characters don't need to be deep, they need to be quickly understood for their roles in the story, no matter how specific or situational. At the same time, the aesthetic of stories as short pulp novels, with characters made flat and details of the physical world unspecified, also fits the perspective of these stories as experienced by players of a role-playing game. The players in the role-playing game aren't given fully defined characters and the world completely spelled out, but are given just enough that as they collaborate to tell the story, details and depths of the characters, both player and non-player, can be created or inferred as the story unfolds. It would certainly make up for the distinct lack of character arcs experienced by the characters in story, for all the protagonists, antagonists, and side characters, as well as the descriptions of items and fixtures filling out the world. In our first story, The Case of the Phantom Prototype, we meet our one main character, Paladin Blake, who seeks justice against all the criminals he can get at, and is motivated by the memory of his late father, a pilot and criminal, a bootlegger and smuggler himself. There are others surrounding Paladin that he relies and calls on, but the main motive behind the story is Paladin's need to turn his quest for justice into success for a private security firm, and then to get even against a conspiracy that nearly killed him as a patsy. The story was actually written and published after the first Crimson Skies computer game, where the player character Nathan Zachary encounters Paladin, already an established head of his private security company, as a sworn enemy for Nathan to fight. Then later, a reluctant ally against another conspiracy involving particularly brutal pirates and a rival security firm taking over from Blake. By the time this written story was published, anyone who had played the first game would have recognized Blake's determination to take down pirates, but also might remember that Blake softened when concerned with less murderous individuals or groups that spare and even help protect the innocents, just like Nathan Zachary and the Fortune Hunters. There's no point in the Phantom Prototype story where Blake considers allying with criminals against those more violent and evil. Anytime Blake isn't fighting criminals is when he's trying not to out himself as their sworn enemy, out to bring down their operations. However, there is at least one example of him making use of a less than upstanding character to get clues as to the goings-on in the criminal underworld and the black market. Despite his namesake, where a paladin is marked by utter intolerance to criminality, Paladin Blake is somewhat more flexible when dealing with, and thus making use of, individuals of ill repute to further his investigations. Given a player/reader's possible memory of Paladin Blake as intolerant of any pirate, the story then gives two distinct contradictions to Blake's relationship with less than legal associations. Before Blake Aviation Security hits the big time, by the end of the Phantom Prototype case, Blake gains a big client in the form of Lockheed after solving the case, not to mention foiling a militant unionist plot to start a war. The sticking point comes from the cover-up of two employees' deaths at the behest of Lockheed, very likely a criminal act enabled by a corruption of police and public officials by corporate interest. At this point, even Paladin Blake isn't confident of bringing Lockheed to justice by exposing their malfeasance, and given that his company gets its boost from Lockheed, he may very well feel the need to make up for this original sin by making his company the most lawful and most zealous enforcers against criminal activity that the reader/player would know from the game. We also learn something new about Paladin Blake in this story that didn't feature in the previous games. We learn through a personal ritual bookending the story that Blake takes time to make a toast in remembrance of his father, who made his living as a pilot smuggling alcohol across state, later national borders, but was killed presumably by the criminals he was delivering to. Despite his recollections of his father as the story goes on, we don't get much insight into Paladin's view of his criminal father, except that even while reaffirming his promise to get every single one of them for you, he always imagines his father laughing at him, as if mocking him for some reason. We don't get an explanation in story, so we can only guess why Paladin would remember his father with a sense of being mocked. Maybe, deep down, his promise feels hollow, as his own dad was one of them, a criminal that has forever gotten away from Paladin. Or maybe getting every criminal won't make up for the cruel irony that his own father was just as much a criminal as all the others Paladin wants to bring down, despite the value Paladin placed in his parenting. In any case, at this point in Paladin's story, criminals are the lowest form of human life, and taking them down is the height of his purpose. The contradiction that Paladin sympathized with one criminal, the patriotic white Russian Peter Justin, and that he couldn't help but abide the criminality of his biggest client, Lockheed, would only fuel his drive for justice, to take down every single criminal he could. But it also could be foreshadowing for when he encounters Nathan Zachary and his Fortune Hunters, and through their battles, his defeat by their flying, and later his alliance with them against a worse enemy, Paladin comes to learn that being an outlaw and being a moral person aren't mutually exclusive. I'd like to think that, had the Crimson Skies universe expanded in literature and gaming, Paladin would eventually reach a point recognizing that, depending on the perspective of who is empowered and who is punished, what is lawful and what is just is not always one and the same, sometimes not even a little. Alas, as of this presentation, Paladin's story only has one other installment, and it continues the mystery of his encounter with that mysterious woman and the unknown party that nearly plunged North America back into war again. That is a future story. Continuing to the second story, we meet a person that we may call a typical pirate leader in the world of Crimson Skies, Jonathan Kahn, nicknamed Genghis, after the Mongol conqueror of ancient history, and leader of the Red Skull Legion. In this world, Kahn may be considered typical because, like other outlaws and bands of air pirates, they raid civilian airships and settlements for valuables, and get by with what they can steal or salvage, especially where there aren't any pirate havens. They operate from an airship and return to a nondescript base in between operations, all the while doing their best to avoid detection from authorities of any nation. What sets Kahn and the Red Skull Legion apart from other pirates is the frequent use of disguises for their airship and planes, and the frequent use of false flag operations, targeting both vulnerable civilians for theft and air militias as well as fellow pirates for deception and destruction. Part of Kahn's brand of piracy is based around the idea, or rather his idea, of the principles of Machiavelli, the Italian Renaissance political leader that is often ascribed, rather superficially, with politics as selective deception and ruthless exploitation. Alas, much of the conflict and difficulties encountered in story by Kahn and his gang comes from his lacking understanding of real Machiavellian principles, and the contradiction in the standard Kahn holds himself to when a favor is called in. What defines Kahn's rise to power as a pirate/gang leader is the scamming of many people for money in order to acquire aircraft, weapons, and the use of further deception to secure a combat airship for use as a base with which to conduct airborne piracy. Lying to countless people to secure money has, by this point in the Red Skull story, caught up with them when they owe a large sum to a mafia boss, who presumably has the power to track down and take down the Red Skulls if they don't pay their dues. Despite his propensity for scamming people out of their money, none of it gives Kahn pause, except for the select few times that he feels he owes someone an unbreakable debt, such as to an old mentor, Hayes, for saving his life, and later to another for the same reason. The contradiction for when Kahn will scam someone and when he will honor his word as iron may be understood through the few times that his worldview comes out in both dialogue and internal monologue. What Kahn supposedly knows is that a man survives by controlling events around him. The challenge for Kahn in the story is that so much has gone out of his control, or is categorically beyond it, and he has to come to grips with that. Another thing that Kahn supposedly knows is that laws are nothing but excuses to keep the strong from preying on the weak, as he puts it, sheep dictating terms to the wolves. These notions would make sense from Kahn's perspective if he thought himself as one of the wolves, and all his marks as sheep to prey on. Yet we can tell from the story that not only is Kahn not the only wolf, he's not even the biggest, because there are plenty of other figures that pose a credible threat to him, and that limit his movements and viable choices. The Red Skull's false flag raid at the beginning of the story is a gambit to secure money to pay back the unseen Giovanni De Carlo from what Kahn owes him, lest Kahn be imperiled every time he lands in the industrial states, and Chicago in particular. Later, when Kahn starts his operation to repay his debt to Hayes and rescue the captive Chang Lu Mei, unbeknownst to him, the British put the bounty on his head that encourages militias and navies over North America to hunt him down, restricting his options for movement and safe harbor. Later, the threat of this bounty is used as leverage against Kahn to, volunteer him to go recover gold needed for a British and Chinese deal. And when Khan stops at Skyhaven to help his ship and crew recover from their wounds, they are beset by a vengeful Nesbit, who challenges them to a winner-take-all death race. This is allowed by the local boss, Regan, on account of credibility to the rules of Skyhaven and the civilians and air pirates living there. The self-presumed wolf, Khan, has no great leverage over DeCarlo, the British, or Regan, and without the big break of the air race, Khan would be one of the sheep getting preyed on. So when Khan risks his ship, crew, and himself to repay a debt to someone, even an old mentor, who later is presumed dead, everyone would be rightly confused. Why should Khan, who sees people as sheep or wolves, give anything of himself for someone else's behalf? The militia pilot Dane makes a guess, and Khan's memory as written confirms. Khan worked with his mentor Hayes in grifting people for money, but when one of the marks caught on and nearly killed Khan, Hayes saved his life, and seemed to make certain to remind Khan of his mortal weakness, that after rolling the cosmic dice enough times, even the great and mighty Genghis Khan can lose it all. Khan's reason for repaying Hayes' favor may have to do with getting rid of a presumed obligation to him that Khan himself despises. We can see this when, as soon as Khan spares Hayes' life at Story's End, and is acknowledged as repaying the favor, Khan immediately kills him. We could guess that Hayes was perhaps emotionally abusive to Khan for his perceived weakness at needing to be saved from death, and when the score was called even, Khan was free to rid himself of the proven traitor. In contrast, Khan seemingly volunteers himself to be indebted to the militia pilot Dane by Story's End, to her surprise, not only for saving his life in the dogfight to retake the airship Machiavelli, but likely in the middle of the story, when her involvement in the airborne death race wins the Red Skulls their salvation. Dane does not understand Khan's reason for this, but we could venture a guess. Perhaps Khan feels that anyone going out of their way for his behalf is so rare that it is precious to him. When Hayes did it and made Khan feel bad for it, it made Khan hate Hayes. When Dane did it, she didn't think to ask anything of Khan in return, so he might have felt right to offer his debt to her willingly. We probably have more evidence that Khan views others' kindness to him as precious. Throughout the story, Khan wonders how bad things will get before the crew, and especially he himself, will just abandon everything and everyone for self-preservation. When it looks like the Red Skulls won't survive the race, Khan gives his crew the option to jump ship and save themselves, even if it means the end of the Red Skulls and Khan's personal enterprise. But with the intervention of one of his crew, his airship captain, reminding everyone of Khan's patronage, giving them their wings to rise as a feared pirate gang, the Red Skulls all then decide to stay and put themselves to the hazard, keeping their dignity and with the race, winning back their future. At this point, Khan now explicitly owes his gang for saving his life as a pirate leader. When Khan is presented by Hayes the option of abandoning his crew for himself, Hayes and the gold, Khan may very well have remembered his unspoken life debt to his crew, and between his debt to Hayes and his debt to his crew, Khan chose his crew and rid himself of Hayes once and for all. Throughout the story, Khan invokes the use of deception and overwhelming force for intimidation and achieving victory, even against long odds against himself and his gang. But despite Khan's invoking of Machiavelli and the principles of being loved or feared, and the general notion of exerting coercive power and control over others to get what you want, Khan's and the Red Skull's understanding of Machiavelli is entirely superficial and decidedly wrong. The real-life historical figure Niccolo Machiavelli held a large and comprehensive view of what makes a good, long-lasting political leadership, as befit his understanding of his world in Renaissance-era Italy. The main point to bring up here is a quote, one part far more often repeated than the other. And here comes in the question whether it is better to be loved rather than feared, or feared rather than loved. It might perhaps be answered that we should wish to be both, but since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. That is the first most remembered part, but what follows is the rest of the quote, often forgotten. Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that, if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared whilst he is not hated. Essentially, the question for lasting as a figure of power is not only whether to be loved or feared, but also to unequivocally avoid being hated. Despite the fear Genghis Khan's Red Skulls inspire in the nations across North America, they unequivocally fail to avoid being hated. The civilians of Deadwood, long hardened against the violence of pirates and other border conflict, were well set to shoot pirates on sight. Khan and his gang, if discovered, would likely have had no hope of surviving. After rescuing Chang from Japanese captivity, the bounty set on their heads sent the whole of the Empire's state navy to seek them out and take them down. Their own home field of the industrial states, and by extension the mafia boss De Carlo, also wouldn't be cowed by Khan's fearsome reputation if it came to a fight. And finally Nesbit, a fellow pirate conned by Khan at story's beginning, comes back with a hateful vengeance to take down Khan when he and his Red Skulls are weakest for his earlier betrayal over Deadwood. Even if the boss of Skyhaven, Regan, owed Khan some favors, he is not compelled to shield Khan from the challenge, except to keep the door open for Khan to escape Skyhaven and Nesbit's wrathful challenge. When Khan verbally sparred with Nesbit upon entry to Skyhaven, Khan invoked how the locals wouldn't tolerate pirates attacking each other, as it would be bad for business, not to mention life in general. What Khan may not have realized is that Regan may have been protecting Khan by not letting anyone know of Khan betraying Nesbit at Deadwood. If the locals don't like pirates attacking each other in Skyhaven, neither would they be so charitable to pirates who betray other pirates even outside Skyhaven. The cooperation needed to survive a life of piracy meant that betraying other pirates, and by extension the civilians who support and benefit from that piracy, would have made Khan and his skulls effectively outlaws to the outlaw community, and just as likely fair game for being preyed on by more upstanding citizen pirates. If the Skyhaven populace got wind of Khan's missteps, Regan's favors to Khan wouldn't save him, especially not to risk Regan's own credibility. If Khan aspired to preserve the power and intimidation of his gang in a way fit to face down his numerous enemies across North America, he would do well to learn the example of being feared while avoiding hatred from another infamous pirate, as shown in the next story. The final story of the book, Crimson Skies, is for the gentleman air pirate Nathan Zachary and the Fortune Hunters. Much of the story's pathos and gravitas can be best appreciated from the reader when they have also experienced the Fortune Hunters' adventures in the previous computer game, where they started out as small-time thieves, were betrayed, then rose to higher exploits across North America before uncovering and defeating their old nemesis again in the skies over Manhattan. This story takes place after those exploits, as experienced by the player and now reader, as Nathan Zachary plays a confidence game to take down a robber baron, save a couple of star-crossed young lovers, and make a little money on the side. It isn't until story's conclusion that we learn that much of what happened in story was the design and machination of Nathan Zachary himself, using a trusted inside man to act the part of newcomer with something to prove. A letter of marque from the Prime Minister to let him freely operate in Louisiana for a time. A squadron of fellow pirates to intervene against the robber baron's insurance, and his own friend, the professor and engineer Fassbinder, to give the edge to himself and his new friends to overcome a high-stakes, death-defying air race with the odds stacked against them. While anti-pirate forces like private security pioneer Paladin Blake are single-minded in taking down criminals, and typical pirates like the Red Skull Legion care only for survival and profit at the expense of civilians, militias, and even other pirates, Nathan Zachary is perhaps an exemplar of earning friends in both low and high places via a code of conduct that earns him and his fortune hunters some moral authority. As stated both in the book and in the previous computer game and supplemental materials, the fortune hunters conduct themselves according to their own articles of piracy. And one clause of those articles are that no member of Zachary's crew shall attack the innocent civilians or bystanders, no matter what operation they're conducting. They'll even go out of their way to protect innocents when more vicious criminals come out to indulge their bloodlust, as seen both in the game and in other stories. On a similar note, throughout their adventures, Nathan Zachary and the fortune hunters have never betrayed anyone that's willingly trusted them or surrendered to them. In this particular adventure, he earns the cooperation, if not the full trust, of a local air pirate, Thibodeau, by making deals where even if Thibodeau loses, he still wins by playing Zachary's game. Zachary builds on Thibodeau's support, and the work of his inside man to get everything he needs to win the con game. At the conclusion of the story, the confluence of all of Zachary's planning involves not just the cooperation of the air pirates, but also law enforcement, the colonial foreign legion, and the nation-state government all banding together to take down the robber baron and his own private cadre of mercenaries and dirty cops, leaving Zachary victorious, the bad guys destitute and arrested, and the young lovers free to make their future. A number of factors motivate Zachary to risk his life, possessions, and gang to take down the robber baron. A well-established sympathy for the underdog in the star-crossed lovers, an utter disdain for bullies, and an insatiable drive to take the high and mighty down a peg or two. Perhaps most important, Zachary and his fortune hunters are motivated to live as they please without compromise, empowered by their flying, their daring exploits, and the freedom to look at a tragic or unjust situation and decide, instead of letting it play out, to act in accordance with their own sense of justice. It's this sense of justice that ends up being far more universal than self-serving, and what earns them a variety of allies, if not true friends, among a variety of other characters in the Crimson Skies universe. In many ways, Nathan Zachary's adventures, both in this book and throughout the Crimson Skies, are exemplary of the highest appeal for the fantasy of being a pirate. Whatever the fear, terror, and brutality of real-life piracy, the appeal of being a pirate in fantasy is, at its simplest, to subvert the presumed power and authority of people and parties, especially those that are oppressive and exploitative. When a party seeks power by saying, "I have this wealth and therefore deserve this power and privilege," a pirate like Nathan Zachary can decide, "No, you don't," and make off with the ill-gotten gains, to the benefit of not just themselves, but also the underprivileged. When a person or party in power says, "This is the way things are and any contradiction is to be punished," a pirate can freely look for the truth, expose the lies, and punish the presumptive powers that be. In fantasy, The more optimistic and lighthearted side of fantasy, that is, being a pirate is almost always detrimental to oppressive powers and beneficial to the little characters, both main and side characters, in a way that's pro-social and builds fellowship. Whether it's taking down a violent party, rescuing an innocent, or returning what was taken by force of authority and arms, one could say, if you want to make friends, fight for justice, and find your fortune. Forget the high and mighty titles. It's a pirate's life for me. If this seems a little out of the blue, it's not only because of my personal favor, it's because the story of Nathan Zachary's adventure and its appeal requires that the reader be familiar with and feel the value of his story from the computer game and the written material both in-game and supplemental besides. Unlike the numerous other named and referenced characters and entities in the Crimson Skies, whose background, motivations, and arcs are left open for interpretation and fabrication by differing authors and gamers as role-players, Nathan Zachary is the closest to a central main character that was written into the universe of Crimson Skies. He has the most defined character journey. He is the most followed character for readers and gamers, and his adventures are at times the most consequential for the world as written, at least as far as those who interact with him are concerned. He even shows up the most in other characters' stories as a major supporting character, whose actions are written to facilitate the other characters' plots. There are a few examples of such, and we'll see them as we read more stories in the future from the Crimson Skies. Part of the charm and appeal of Crimson Skies, at least from my perspective, is that the adventures are facilitated for the characters by the wide access to different places and people using the power of flight. Just as automobiles are a major personal investment in our world, so are airplanes in this universe. You don't get very far or very fast without knowing how to fly. In addition, the skies are decidedly not safe. Bandits, rival militias, and criminals fly every which way over closed borders. So not only would you need to know how to fly, but also how to defend yourself. Being a skilled enough flyer and fighter also makes you valuable. The setup is, by design, the ultimate validation for having a love and knowledge of flying, and air combat as an extension and expression thereof. To make things interesting, the world of Crimson Skies is populated by a large variety of different and iconic aircraft, of which only a fraction is portrayed in this story. More are drawn and described in other written materials that can be employed in role-playing, so that one can really feel like a unique pilot flying an utterly unique flying machine with which to express one's flying skill, at least as imagination allows, and with which you wager on a daredevil adventure. As surely as a personal attachment to one's vehicle may compel one to find ways of making it stand out, so too did I find the appeal of contemplating the variety of imaginary aircraft as portrayed in Crimson Skies. I used the word iconic earlier because such is the range of configurations and designs that I and anyone would be hard-pressed to mistake one type for another. It's a far cry from real-life aircraft and aviation development that has a far more convergent evolution, to a few select forms as the most common, such that I can't blame anyone for deciding that aircraft, especially civilian aircraft, look all the same. I had the same problem with cars. Alas, what is appealing in fiction and balanced for fun gameplay and role-playing would be much less practical and optimal in real life. In real life, making aircraft efficient and optimal for their tasks, payloads, and flight profiles is far away more important than looking cool and unique. Not to mention that, with the trained eye of an aeronautical engineer, or even a simulator, the many problems of the Crimson Skies aircraft as drawn would inevitably crop up, likely proving over and over again why real-life aircraft development is more convergent than greatly varied. Unlike cars that need relatively few things to function, an aircraft needs far more to go right to successfully fly in a powered, controlled manner, before any consideration of mission or payload. So the wondrous flying machines of Crimson Skies could never be realized in real life, one-to-one in form, but I personally found it a great inspiration to study engineering and to contemplate how flying could be just as fun and personal, and not just an optimized, efficient mode of transport. Flying them would be its own reward. Adding to the wondrous fantasy is the use of airships, not just as a set dressing where cars and trains wouldn't do for cross-country adventure, but as intimately connected to the characters and ensembles of pilots and planes, as a sailing ship is to classical pirate and high seas adventures. The airships are big, far bigger than they ever got in real life, and for every group hold everything they need for their adventures, all while providing a constant setting for the characters to live and interact within, at least until they reach a new destination. For the characters themselves, airships allow them to range far and wide as a home away from home. And just like home, they must be defended, because despite being armed akin to old sailing ships, complete with broadside cannons, among other arms, they're not invulnerable superweapons, and have to be preserved, or else the band of pilot pirates ends up grounded. The details of their operation are left out. In fact, in role-playing, marking out the arrangement of an airship's size, plan, and components is an exercise unto itself. But the intricacies of airship operation and flight never get in the way of the adventure and drama. There's no way a happy outcome is ruined by a bad airship landing or docking maneuver, for example. Airships also provide another role in the Crimson Skies universe. They're an expression of power that can be wielded by characters and other parties as a show of force or intent. After all, in these disunited states of America, civilian authority is limited to local militias and hired security, and military force via armies, armor, and naval forces isn't a factor, and wouldn't be as conducive to high-flying adventures. The closest real-life equivalent would be a story of a squadron at a fixed airbase or an aircraft carrier, and indeed those stories may have been done before, but it's not Crimson Skies without the airships. Indeed, an airship showing up to the story almost always portrays an escalation of the danger and the stakes of the adventure. And unlike real-life combat with ships, fighting with and against airships in the Crimson Skies involves just as much action outside of cockpits as inside cockpits. So having flights of aircraft making bombing and torpedo runs on airships happens just as often as aircrew jumping ship, or jumping plane, to board airships, just like boarding sailing ships in the Age of Sail. When not in combat, airships are a good way to transport characters and ensembles to far-off locations, in a way that would be far less tedious than if the journeys had to be portrayed as by ground vehicle, or water-bound vessel, or even on foot. As just one example, the very first adventure of Crimson Skies, portrayed in interactive media, the first computer game, is a good old-fashioned pirate treasure hunt in the lush, beautiful Hawaiian Islands. And the airships make it possible to fly around hunting for gold and fighting enemies, from Imperial squadrons to rival pirates, and literally get the gold in the end. And that's just one introductory chapter of a larger series of episodic stories in a larger world. That larger world is defined primarily by the expansion of air travel, not just international travel and commerce, but also domestic, and including urban air travel. Today, this idea of urban air travel can be recognized in aviation technology and engineering circles in the multiple projects for electric air mobility. But way back when Crimson Skies was conceived, it was depicted and likely imagined mostly as domestic air travel between different areas, each with their own runway and airport connected to the local public transport system. or other shared mobility. There are still cars, buses, local trains, and their airborne equivalents, autogyros and blimps. But unlike our real world and history, not everyone would have a car. Why would they when an aircraft can take you anywhere out of town? There are no state route or interstate highways after all. In a more stylized depiction of domestic aircraft transport, the Crimson Skies console game actually depicts a rather cartoonish setup, with little runways dotted periodically over the land, right next to urban, industrial, and commercial centers, even on high-rise buildings. The closest real-life equivalents to these are the air parks or fly-in communities, where residential buildings are combined with hangars for privately owned aircraft, which access a runway to fly out to other destinations. It's similar to suburban neighborhoods where residents need cars to leave the neighborhood before they can go out and do anything. Which is fine if the experience involves never having the character leave their aircraft. It just wouldn't make a very compelling story because eventually the characters need to leave their aircraft to go and interact with the world and other people. Imagine if every establishment had to allot parking for aircraft right there on the property, the way it's done for cars today. This could only work for isolated, distant establishments. Of course, the way to travel in the Crimson Skies universe is by airship. Just like a certain excited announcer says, "It's the king of commerce. Old-fashioned trains, ships, and trucks are no match for the modern Zeppelin. Shipments have never been faster. Mountains, forests, and rivers? No problem for these luxury liners of the skies." Alas, in the Crimson Skies, airships are beset by airborne piracy and other enemies that make airships and their cargoes a target. Such is the price of a great nation splintered into bitter rivals and precious few allies. From the point of view that looks at the Crimson Skies through the lens of interstate conflict, criminal activity, and the costs thereof, it should be clear that this high-flying, adventure-filled world wouldn't last very long in its current state. As portrayed in these stories, aircraft are damaged or lost, and pilots are injured or killed at a rate that couldn't be taken lightly for a nation-state, especially those so small and formerly interdependent, but now cut off, as those of the former United States now broken up. To illustrate the point, we can make a roughly similar comparison to the total aircraft production of the United States in World War II, as the Crimson Skies aircraft are roughly similar in construction and technology to the real-life aircraft of World War II. And that is, they use all-metal airframes with piston engines driving propellers, weapons of machine guns, autocannons, rockets, and bombs, metal armor, and petrochemical fuel, along with the same demand for parts and substances for service and maintenance. In World War II, from 1939 to 1945, the United States produced approximately 300,000 individual aircraft, and deployed them far and wide in the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, shipping them by, ship, and ferrying them across the world to fight America's enemies, as well as supplying America's allies. With all the many different models and variants designed, built, and deployed throughout the war, pilots were fighting, taking losses, receiving maintenance and replacements to keep flying and fighting. And they were supported by a massive logistics network of resource extraction, material processing, industrial production, and transportation to get everything where they needed to go. If we're generous and say that the America of Crimson Skies has some or even most of the same industrial, economic, and logistical capacity in place, when one considers how the alternate United States splits up, it's very significant how, at the same time, the industrial capacity of any new nation-state, and especially manufacturer, would be drastically cut. Not just a little, not just linearly, but far and away more. Everything that goes into the production of an aircraft, let alone many more, comes from many different sources, from many different suppliers, and many different specialty corporations, and they're not all evenly distributed everywhere. When state lines become hard national borders, the lines of supply for all the manufacturers for all the different parts that come together to make aircraft are now cut off. Whereas before, shipments of materials, parts, and supplies likely could flow with ease and speed, now they have to negotiate geopolitical boundaries, especially hostile ones as well. Without international agreements for the safe and timely transport of materials, aircraft manufacturers in this world have to secure their own international transport, as well as its protection from piracy, and especially its insurance against loss. The alternative is for a manufacturer to live in a new nation that has everything it needs to support its own aircraft production, completely independent of trade. Even where this is possible, it's still far and away from ideal that, no matter where you live in North America, the production of aircraft that is now vital to trade and defense is now seriously hamstrung. This is significant because the fantasy requires that aircraft, especially fighting aircraft, be as present and available, at least as much as aircraft were in World War II, to be easily available to pilots and easily replaceable. As one character said, Devastators are a dime a dozen. And as another character found, they're easily found far away from North America, including such remote regions as the islands of the South Pacific. Without the suspension of disbelief, it would be hard to conclude anything other than the longer the pirate and militia conflicts drag on in the Crimson Skies, the more people will go backwards to making aircraft out of more common materials, such as wood, fabric, and wire, World War I style, just to keep flying. Or else flying no longer becomes feasible for crossing borders as often as needed for the stories to unfold. If the Crimson Skies had further developed as a franchise, I could easily see the attrition of planes and pilots pushing society into marking them as especially precious, so that when some external threat or challenge pushes the meta plot forward, there are higher stakes for those characters that do go flying and fighting. It might even be enough to push the nation-states to join back together, one way or another, if the threat is big enough. We actually got a taste of this possible overarching plot in The Phantom Prototype, when Paladin Blake foils a militant unionist plot to send North America back into war again. The great shame that I feel about the Crimson Skies universe is that I saw so much potential in how overarching plots could be conceived of, and how the characters regularly referenced and followed throughout the literature and interactive media could contribute to those overarching plots, essentially making history in-universe. And it doesn't seem to be for lack of material either. If you go and find the mirror site for the original Crimson Skies website, you'll find many different pages framed as newspaper articles and novellas or pulp novels that narrate the happenings and goings-on in the world. They may not be very deep or complex or even that imaginative on their own, but taken together, they can help build up a world where many adventurers come up for individuals or small groups, such that daring, improvisation, and luck would be part and parcel for living in that world. The shame is that, in my opinion, it didn't get the love it deserved, so it has essentially been left dormant, and bar a few individuals such as myself and others on the internet, it's not likely to be remembered for its unique aesthetics or narrative possibility, especially where the depiction of flying and a world based around aviation is concerned. For everyone who indulged me on this, my personal gem of obscurity, I want to thank you for listening in once more, and be assured there are more stories to come from the world of Crimson Skies, most of which qualify as short stories, so we'll cover 2 or more at a time once we circle back to it. There are also 2 novels that were each supposed to be the start of two trilogies, Wings of Fortune and Wings of Justice, but were never popular enough to be published past the first books here in America. Funnily enough, they were popular enough in Germany to be printed in full over there. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be learning German anytime soon, so when I get around to them, I'll only be able to elaborate on their larger story arcs via the book blurbs. For now, we return to the world of Kenneth Opel's Airborne series, as we find our heroes Matt and Kate taking another adventure into the sky to find a long-missing, legendary, and derelict airship, the Hyperion. Next time, it's Kenneth Opel's Skybreaker.